The wind was quiet, but carried a hint of something unusual, like the air was charged with anticipation. The streetlights flickered on, casting a dim yellow glow over the sidewalk as Sarah walked slowly down the path, her footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. She had always loved the feeling of being alone in the evening, when everything seemed to settle, and the world felt paused just for a moment. But tonight was different. There was something in the air that made her uneasy, something she couldn't put her finger on, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She paused for a second, turning her head slowly to glance behind her. But the street was empty, just a few scattered leaves blowing in the breeze. She let out a breath of relief and continued walking. But her pace quickened just a bit, her senses heightened. Every small sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should have. The path ahead seemed long, though she knew it would only take a few minutes to get home. Still, the unease was growing. She checked her watch, almost expecting the time to be earlier than it was. But no, it was just past 9. And she had plenty of time. She reminded herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But even as she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling. She stopped in front of an old bookstore that had been there for years. The windows were dark, but the shop was still open. She hesitated for a moment before deciding to step inside. There was no real reason to, but something about the place always made her feel comfortable. It was familiar in a way that made her feel grounded. And for just a moment she needed that sense of calm. She pushed open the door, which let out a low creak as she entered. The warmth of the shop, wrapping around her like a hug, the smell of old books and dust filled the air, and for a moment she closed her eyes, breathing it all in. The world outside felt far away, and it was a relief. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved deeper into the store, her fingers grazing the spines of the books. As she walked slowly past the shelves, the world outside seemed distant here, the noise of the city muffled and faint. It was easy to forget about the strange feeling that had been creeping up on her. She moved towards the back of the store, where the light was a little dimmer, and the atmosphere felt even more peaceful. But as she reached for a book on a shelf in the corner, something caught her eye. There was a figure standing by the window outside. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was barely visible, but she could make out the silhouette of a person standing still in the shadows, watching her. She didn't know how long the person had been standing there, or if they were watching her at all, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't the first time she had felt like someone was following her, but this time it felt different. She turned quickly to glance around the store. There was no one else inside, just the sound of the clock ticking softly on the wall. The figure outside was still there, but now they seemed to be closer, almost as if they had moved towards the door. Sarah's heart began to race, and her instincts told her it was time to leave. Sarah took a deep breath and quickly moved towards the door. Her footsteps were hurried now, her mind racing. She reached for the handle, but as her fingers touched it, she hesitated for a moment. The figure outside had moved closer, still barely visible in the dim light, but there was something different about the way they stood, almost unnaturally still, as though they were waiting for something or someone. She swallowed hard, trying to shake the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. But the tension in the air was palpable. It was as if the world had frozen and was watching her every move with a sense of knowing. She tried to steady her breathing and open the door, but before she could, the bell above the entrance rang, signaling someone was entering. She froze, her hand still on the door handle. The sound of footsteps followed as a man entered the shop, his figure casting a long shadow across the room. His presence was enough to make Sarah's heart skip a beat, but she didn't turn to look at him. Not yet. She stood motionless, staring at the door, wondering if she should step outside and face whatever was waiting for her out there, or if she should stay hidden in the shop, waiting for whatever might happen to pass. She could hear the man's footsteps growing closer, his movements deliberate, like he was aware of her hesitation, but not in a threatening way, just steady and calm, as though he had all the time in the world. Sarah tried to steady herself, focusing on the door and the cold air she felt seeping in through the crack. As the man approached, she could feel the weight of his gaze even without looking at him. It was as if he had a sense of her, every thought, her every fear. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat dry and tight, her fingers clenched around the door handle, as if it was her only lifeline to the world outside. She felt the man stop behind her, and for a moment Everything was still, nothing moved, not a sound, not a breath. She knew he was there, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around. Something inside her told her not to, not yet. She could hear him clear his throat softly, and then his voice, low and calm, broke the silence. "Are you all right, Sarah?" She froze. Her name felt foreign in his mouth, but it was unmistakable. It was her name, and the man knew it. How did he know? She turned slowly, her heart racing, her breath shallow. And there he stood, a tall figure with dark eyes, and a face that seemed both familiar and distant. His smile was small and almost comforting, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze felt cold and calculating, as if he had been watching her for much longer than she realized. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body remained frozen in place. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. All she could do was stare at him as he took a step closer and whispered softly, "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. How did he know her name? Who was this man? And why did he speak like that, as if he already knew everything about her? She took a step back, feeling the cold air from the door rush past her and into the shop. It felt like the space around her had shrunk, the walls pressing in closer, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She glanced towards the door, hoping for a way out, but the man blocked her path, his presence too imposing. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice, but it failed her once again. The man didn't seem to mind. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving her face, his smile widening ever so slightly, and he repeated his words, "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" The way he said it made Sarah's blood run cold, as if he was speaking the truth, as though somehow she had been expecting this moment. Without even knowing it, she felt a cold sweat trickle down the back of her neck, and the world around her seemed to blur, her senses overwhelmed by the strange feeling that had taken over the room. Her feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. She didn't know what to do or where to go. Her instincts told her to run, but something inside told her that she had to stay, as if this was a moment she couldn't escape from. The man's voice broke through her thoughts, again calm and almost reassuring. "It's all right, you don't need to be afraid, Sarah. I'm not here to harm you. I've come to offer you something you've been searching for a long time." She felt a pang of confusion. What was he talking about? Searching for what? Was this man's game? What did he want from her? She opened her mouth to ask, but the words didn't come. Her throat was too tight. Instead, she just stared at him, unable to tear her eyes away. His gaze seemed to pull her in, as if he were reading her every thought, everything she had ever kept buried inside her. He took a step closer, and Sarah's body tensed, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She could feel his presence surrounding her like a heavy fog, clouding her thoughts. He leaned in just slightly and whispered, "You felt the emptiness, haven't you? The void that nothing seems to fill, no matter how much you try to fill it." He knew her thoughts, her struggles, the way she had always felt like something was missing, like she was always searching for something that just wasn't there. It made her stomach turn. How could he know all of that? She hadn't told anyone, not even her closest friends. The weight of his words hung in the air, like a secret she wasn't ready to hear. But his voice continued, soothing like velvet, with just the right touch of something dark and unsettling. "I can give you what you've been longing for, Sarah. All you have to do is trust me." She could feel her heart racing faster with every word, every step. He took closer to her. His offer was tempting in a way that felt wrong, but there was something about it that felt like it could answer everything she had ever wondered about herself. Something about him seemed to hold the key to her past and maybe her future, but at what cost? Sarah could feel the weight of his words pressing against her chest, her mind racing with questions. She didn't know how to ask, her thoughts tangled in a knot she couldn't untangle. Her body felt frozen, and yet every instinct in her screamed to run, to get away from this man who knew too much, who spoke too softly, and yet carried so much power. His presence was suffocating, the air around her thick with tension. The silence between them stretched on like a long shadow. She wanted to scream, but her voice was stuck in her throat, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the cool sweat on the back of her neck. As she slowly took a step back, her eyes still locked on his face, his smile never wavering. As he stood in front of her, waiting patiently, like a predator watching its prey, she took another step back. But before she could move any farther, he spoke again, his voice low and steady. "You're afraid, aren't you, Sarah? You think I'm dangerous. But I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help you find what you've been looking for all this time." The words felt like a lullaby in the dark, They were so soft, so soothing, yet the meaning behind them twisted her stomach into knots. His words didn't match the feeling his presence gave off. It was as if he was playing with her mind, as if he knew exactly how to manipulate her into doing what he wanted. She could feel her heart beating faster, her mind spinning with conflicting thoughts. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to take that step into the unknown, to find whatever it was he promised. But another part of her screamed in protest, warning her that something was terribly wrong. But that feeling of emptiness, the one he spoke of, it was real. It had always been there. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. The void inside her grew wider the more she tried to fill it. No matter how much she surrounded herself with people or distractions, nothing ever seemed to make it go away. The man stepped closer again. And this time she didn't move. She couldn't. She felt paralyzed, trapped by the pull of his words. He looked down at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see through her, like she wasn't even standing there, like he could reach inside her mind and read her every secret. I can show you the way to fill that emptiness, Sarah. I can make it all make sense if you trust me. Just take my hand, and I will lead you to what you've always been searching for. She felt her breath catch in her throat. His words seemed to wrap around her like chains, pulling her closer to him. She wanted to pull away, to run, to fight. But she couldn't move. It was as if his voice had taken control of her body, her thoughts clouded with doubt and longing. She tried to think of a reason to refuse, but nothing came to mind. She had always wanted answers. She had always been searching for something to make her feel whole again. Could this man really offer her that? Could he give her the sense of purpose she had spent so long chasing? But at what cost? Would she lose herself in the process? Would she become someone else, someone she couldn't recognize anymore? A small voice in her mind screamed that it was too dangerous, but the other part of her was already reaching out, her hand almost against her, while waiting for him to take it. Sarah's hand hovered just inches from his, the air thick with anticipation, her pulse racing, as if her very soul was caught between two worlds, one where she could walk away and never look back, and another where she could step forward into the unknown and let him take her wherever he wanted her to go. She could hear her breath in her ears, so loud, so fast, as if her body was betraying her. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her fingers trembled with the temptation to reach out and take his hand. The feeling of emptiness inside her was suffocating, pulling her down like a deep well. It was too much to ignore. It had been with her for so long that it was starting to feel like a part of her, like a shadow that never left. No matter how hard she tried to outrun it, his offer was tempting, too tempting. And it made her wonder if this man had the answer she had been searching for all this time. But as her fingers moved closer to his, she saw something in the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement at the edge of the door. Her gaze snapped to it, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure she didn't recognize. But there was something about them that felt familiar, something about the way they stood, tall and silent, as if they had been waiting for her the entire time. The man in front of her didn't seem to notice. He was too focused on her, his eyes dark and patient as he waited for her decision. But Sarah couldn't look away from the figure by the door. It was a woman, her features hidden by the shadows, but Sarah could feel her eyes on her, as if she was the key to something. The woman stepped forward slowly, her movement deliberate and graceful, as though she had all the time in the world to watch Sarah and the man. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and without thinking she pulled her hand back quickly. As if to protect herself, she took a step backward, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The man's eyes flickered for just a second as he turned toward the woman, his expression changing from calm to something darker, something colder. Sarah didn't know what was happening or why this woman felt so important, but she knew she had to get away from them both. There was something off about the entire situation. She felt trapped, caught between two forces that wanted to pull her in different directions. The woman's gaze never left Sarah as she took another step closer, and the man stepped back as if giving her room, but his eyes never left Sarah. Not for a second. Something in the woman's gaze felt like a warning, a signal that this moment could be the end of everything Sarah had ever known. She wanted to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor, as if something was holding her in place, something invisible that wouldn't let her move. Her body was shaking now, her mind screaming at her to act, to do something. But she was frozen in place. The woman spoke then, her voice low and clear like a melody that carried a weight she wasn't supposed to hear. "It's not him you should fear, Sarah," she said, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "It's not him who will change you. It's the one who speaks so softly, who makes you believe everything he says, that you should be afraid of the words struck Sarah like a thunderbolt, her blood running cold, as the man's expression twisted into something unrecognizable, something dark and predatory, his eyes narrowing, as if he were no longer trying to convince her to trust him, but to force her to obey. Sarah's heart raced as the woman's words echoed in her mind like a warning siren. She could feel the air around her growing heavier, as if the room itself was closing in on her. The man's eyes were fixed on her now, his gaze colder than before, his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. She could feel the tension building in the room, as if everything was about to explode. The woman stood perfectly still, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. But there was something about her that felt calming despite the warning in her voice, something that made Sarah feel like she wasn't completely alone anymore. The man's presence felt suffocating, but the woman's gaze felt like a lifeline, like someone who understood the weight of the moment. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to process everything she was hearing and seeing. It was too much, too many pieces falling into place, too many questions. She had no answers to. The woman stepped forward slowly, her movements measured but graceful, as if she knew exactly how to handle this situation. The man took a step back, almost reluctantly, his eyes flicking between Sarah and the woman, as if he was trying to decide whether to stay or go. But he didn't say anything, he just watched, waiting for Sarah to make the next move. The woman spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "It's time to make a choice, Sarah," she said. "You've been searching for answers your entire life, but you've always known deep down that there are forces at work here that you don't understand, forces that are trying to pull you in different directions." She paused, her eyes filled with something that felt like sympathy or maybe understanding, but there was a sadness in them too. "You can't trust him," she said, pointing at the man behind Sarah. "But you can't run from this either. Running won't change anything, it won't fill the emptiness inside of you. The choice is yours, Sarah. But you have to decide now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her mind spinning, as she looked between the man and the woman, the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. She had spent her whole life trying to fill the void within her, searching for something that would make everything make sense, searching for meaning, searching for connection. And now here were two people who claimed to have the answers, but both seemed so different, one promising everything with soft words and empty promises, and the other warning her of the dangers she couldn't see yet. But that wasn't the only question on her mind. Who were these people? How had they found her? How did they know so much about her? Did they know the pain she had carried with her all these years? The longing, the emptiness, the fear of never truly belonging. She couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. She had to make a choice. But how could she know which was the right path? She couldn't trust the man. His words had already begun to feel like lies. But could she trust the woman? Was she really here to help? Or was she just another part of the game? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, her hands trembling, as she tried to calm herself. The decision was hers, and it had never felt more impossible. Truth from herself, from the choices she had always put off, from the parts of her life that she had kept hidden in the shadows. She had always thought there was something wrong with her, always believed that if she tried hard enough she could fill the emptiness. But nothing ever worked, not the distractions, not the people, not the constant noise that she used to drown out the silence. Nothing had ever truly filled the hole inside of her. It had only gotten worse the longer she pretended to ignore it. But now here she was standing between two people who seemed to hold the answers to everything she had ever wondered. And the weight of that truth made her chest tighten. She could feel her breath becoming shallow, and the panic rising inside her. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know who to trust. It felt like the world had tilted, and everything she had known was now uncertain. She glanced at the man again. But this time she saw something different in his eyes, something darker, something that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and he was waiting for her to fall. He stepped closer, just a fraction of an inch, his body language no longer friendly or inviting but possessive, like he was preparing to claim her, like he had always known she would come to him eventually. He reached his hand toward her, but before he could touch her, she took another step back instinctively, like a spark igniting within her, telling her to stay away, to trust the woman whose gaze was unwavering. Sarah didn't know why she trusted her, but in that moment it felt right. The woman had never tried to manipulate her, never tried to force her into anything. She had only spoken the truth, the raw truth that Sarah had been avoiding for so long. "You have the strength to choose Sarah. The woman's voice cut through the fog in Sarah's mind. The truth is inside you. It always has been. You've just been afraid of what it means to face it. But you can't keep running. You can't keep hiding from the pieces of yourself that you fear the most. Sarah's chest tightened, as if something inside her was awakening, like a door she had kept locked for so long was now opening inch by inch. But she still didn't know what was behind it. She glanced at the man again, and for a moment she felt that same pull toward him. But it was different this time. It felt wrong, like a trap waiting to close around her. He had always known how to speak to her, how to make her feel like he was offering her something she wanted. But now she saw through it now. She saw him for what he really was. His words were empty promises, his smile a mask to hide the darkness beneath. She felt a wave of disgust wash over her. She couldn't trust him. She couldn't let him in. She turned back to the woman, her heart racing, but her mind more clear than it had ever been before. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. The woman's face softened, and for the first time since she had entered the shop, Sarah saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You've made the right choice, Sarah," the woman said. And as she spoke, Sarah felt the weight of the decision lift from her shoulders, as if something deep within her had clicked into place. The emptiness was still there, but now it felt different. It was no longer an insurmountable void. It was just a part of her, something she could understand, and maybe even heal. The man's eyes widened just for a moment, his mask of calm cracking, as he took a step forward, his hand still outstretched. But now there was a raw desperation in his movements, like he was losing control, like he hadn't expected her to choose the woman. The tension in the room shifted suddenly, as if the very air had thickened around them. Sarah felt the weight of his gaze on her, as though his eyes were trying to tear through her soul, to pull her back into his grasp. But she stood her ground. She couldn't go back. She couldn't let him win. The woman beside her seemed to sense her determination and moved to stand a little closer, her presence a shield between Sarah and the man. Sarah's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she felt the man's eyes bore into her with a mixture of rage and disbelief. But it wasn't fear that surged through her. It was clarity. She could see him for who he truly was now, a predator disguised as a savior, a master of manipulation who used words as weapons to break people down and bend them to his will. But no more, not her, no more. She wasn't afraid anymore. The woman spoke again, her voice softer, but still strong. "The choice you've made, Sarah, is the beginning of your journey," she said. "It's not the end. You will face challenges ahead. There are things you still don't know, but now you can face them without fear. Now you know that you are the one who holds the power." Sarah nodded slowly. She didn't fully understand what the woman meant, but there was something comforting in her words, something that gave her strength. She looked back at the man who stood frozen now, his hand still extended, but his posture rigid, as if he was waiting for her to change her mind, or maybe he was preparing for something else. Sarah couldn't tell, but she wasn't going to give him the chance to manipulate her again. She wasn't going to let him twist her choices anymore. The woman beside her turned her attention back to the man, her eyes narrowing slightly, but there was no fear in her gaze, only certainty. "You've lost, Sarah," she said quietly, her voice filled with an unspoken challenge. The man didn't respond. He just stood there staring at Sarah with a look of quiet fury. But it didn't affect her. She felt the last of her fear drain away, leaving only resolve behind. Sarah felt lighter, almost like a weight had been lifted from her chest. She didn't know where this new strength was coming from, but it was there, and it felt real. She could feel the air in the room shift again, like the world itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. The man didn't move, his eyes still fixed on Sarah, as if he was waiting for something to break. But nothing did. The woman beside Sarah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and smiled, a soft, reassuring smile that made Sarah feel like she was exactly where she needed to be in that moment. The man took one last look at her, as though calculating his next move, but Sarah didn't flinch this time. She stood tall. She was done with fear, done with the emptiness that had plagued her for so long, done with the uncertainty that had held her back. She had made her choice, and she was ready to face whatever came next. With the woman by her side, Sarah knew that whatever challenges were ahead, she could handle them, she could face them. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally free. The man's presence lingered for a moment longer, his eyes burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. But he didn't move, not toward her, not away from her, just stood there frozen, as if caught between two choices, neither of which he wanted to make. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, He lowered his hand slowly, as if accepting defeat, but his eyes never left Sarah, his gaze full of something that wasn't anger, it was darker. It was the kind of look that made her wonder if she had just made a dangerous enemy, if she had made a decision that might come back to haunt her later. But in that moment she didn't care. She had chosen the path that felt right, even if it was uncertain. She had chosen to trust herself. And that was all that mattered. The woman beside her turned towards Sarah, with a knowing smile, as though she could sense the relief that was flooding through her. "It's done," she said simply. "You've taken the first step now, there's no turning back." But that's not a bad thing. Sarah felt a surge of both fear and excitement in her chest, the weight of the unknown settling over her. But the woman's words were a comfort, a reminder that she was no longer alone, no longer trapped in the same cycle of emptiness she had been for so long. She looked at the man one last time before he turned and walked slowly toward the door, without another word, just a slight glance over his shoulder that felt like a promise, or maybe a threat. She couldn't tell. But she knew one thing for sure: he was no longer a part of her life, at least not in the way he had been before he was gone now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that his shadow still loomed over her, just out of reach, ready to strike when she least expected it. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was next. She didn't know what would happen after this. She didn't know where this journey would take her. But she knew she had taken control of her life in a way that she never had before. The woman beside her turned to face her fully, her expression soft but serious. "There will be challenges ahead," she said. "They won't be easy, but you don't have to face them alone." "Not anymore." Sarah nodded silently, not knowing what to say but feeling something shift inside her, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. The weight of her past had been lifted, but the future still felt unclear. She glanced at the woman, who seemed to know exactly what she was thinking. "Don't worry," the woman said, her voice gentle and reassuring. "You've made the right choice. You've already taken the hardest step." Sarah felt a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. For the first time in so long it felt genuine. It felt like hope, not the kind of hope that relied on empty promises, but the kind of hope that came from knowing she was capable of facing whatever came next, that she was strong enough to handle the challenges ahead. As the woman began to lead her toward the door, Sarah felt something stir inside her, a feeling that everything had changed, and that maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to find the answers she had been searching for all along. As they stepped toward the door, Sarah could feel the weight of everything behind her, the choices she had made, the fear she had overcome, the emptiness that had once consumed her now felt distant, as though it no longer had a hold on her. The woman led her through the door and into a world that felt different. Somehow the air was crisp and fresh, the world outside alive in a way it had never seemed before. It was as if she was seeing everything for the first time. The colors were more vivid, the sounds clearer, and there was a sense of possibility that hung in the air, as though anything could happen and Sarah could choose what that would be. The woman walked beside her, her pace steady and calm. But Sarah could feel the change within herself, the quiet strength that had always been there, but had been buried under layers of doubt and fear. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time she didn't feel paralyzed by it. She felt ready to face whatever came her way, and maybe even embrace it with open arms. They walked in silence for a while, the world around them bustling, but for Sarah it felt like she was in her own bubble, like the noise of everything else faded away. And it was just the two of them, the woman's presence, a steady guide through this new chapter in her life. The woman broke the silence first. "There are things you still need to learn," she said, her voice soft, but with an edge of purpose. "But you're ready now, Sarah. You weren't ready before, because you were still afraid. But now you understand that fear doesn't define you. You can choose how to move forward. And that's the power you've always had." Sarah nodded again, the words resonating deep within her like a truth she had always known, but had never fully understood. She had spent so long letting fear control her life, letting it dictate the choices she made. But now she knew she could change, that she could be different. She could be someone who didn't run from fear, but faced it head on. The woman glanced at her, a small smile playing on her lips, as if she could sense the shift in Sarah's energy. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "You always have been. The only thing you needed was to realize it for yourself." Sarah didn't reply right away. Instead, she looked around at the world. Before her, the street was alive with people and energy. But it all felt different now. It wasn't just noise, it was opportunity, it was life. It was a chance to truly live without the constant weight of uncertainty hanging over her. She felt the stirring of excitement within her, the kind that had been buried for so long, the excitement that came from knowing she was finally free to make her own choices and to face whatever came next with confidence. The woman paused in front of her, turning slightly so Sarah could see her fully. Your journey isn't over, Sarah, she said. You just begun, but you're no longer alone. You have the strength to face the challenges ahead, and you have the power to shape your own story. Sarah smiled for the first time in what felt like forever, a genuine smile, not one built on fear or uncertainty, but one that came from within, a smile that said she was ready to take the next step. And whatever that step was, she would face it head on because she was no longer running. And for the first time in her life, she knew that was enough.